Hello and welcome to El Partido, yet another Spanish football podcast. And as always, as we usually promise, just a little bit of nostalgia. We are back to normality. We did have a slight hiccup last week with Elon Musk turned the internet off or something, and we couldn't record our usual show, so it was a slight solo podcast on Hercules. But I'm delighted to say that my co-host Paul, we're back. We're back to talk about some fantastic Spanish football, aren't we?
We are. I missed you last week, but I thought you did a sterling job without me when the marvels of scientific advance kept us apart for once. Actually, did miss you, but you didn't miss me. It was a cracking episode that you put together. Shame that we couldn't discuss it together, but I thought we made a nice what do you call it? A solo cast, I think was the phrase you used.
Yeah. It would have been nice to wax lyrical with you about David Trezeguet in Alicante, but you know these things do happen, and the gremlins inside the internet can sometimes get the better of all of us. But we persevere and we carried on. Yes. And if you're watching this on YouTube as well, you may notice. Do not readjust your radio sets. My El Pozo colleague Liam Bambridge, of Spanish Segunda show fame, is joining us as well, and you may note he's wearing a Real Zaragoza shirt, Liam. Fancy telling us why you might be wearing that shirt tonight?
Yeah, I think we're going to talk about fallen giants, aren't we? And the first in this series was a few weeks ago, wasn't it? And I think you focused on Deportivo, didn't you, La Coruña? And unfortunately, my beloved Real Zaragoza fall very much into the category of fallen giants, sadly, as we speak in 2024-25, at the end of the 2024-25 season.
Yeah, it must be a strange concept to be invited on to talk about the club you love at a low ebb. But, you know, I think the good thing about this podcast, especially focusing on the nostalgia and the history, is that we go to look at them at their high points as well, which is usually quite good. And that's certainly what we're going to do today. But I suppose when we ask, how does a man from who lives in Manchester now, I'm going to say I'm not quite too sure where you're from originally. I'm sure you'll tell us. How does one fall in love with not only a Spanish side? That does happen a lot. It's happened for me, Malaga, Paul, you with Mallorca. Real Zaragoza for me feels a bit off the beaten track. How does someone from England become a Real Zaragoza fan?
Well, it all comes down to my year abroad during my degree. And as with Spain, I started studying Spanish at university, having never studied before. I studied it from scratch at Inicio. Kind of made a decision in the registration hall. I wasn't going to study French and German. I was going to do French and Spanish instead, despite never having been to Spain before. Similarly, never been to Aragon before, which is the Comunidad Autónoma from which Real Zaragoza come, but that was where I chose to spend my year abroad as a teaching assistant. And I suppose realistically, given my background, I'm a Norwich City fan. I grew up in the wilds of Norfolk. I was always going to support my local team. Clearly, even in 1992-93 season, most of the attention, as it always is, was on Real Madrid and Barcelona. But I was going to Zaragoza, which is a sizable city, I should say, between Madrid and Barcelona, and I was always going to support the local team when I got there, and that's what I did.
Yeah, well, no, that seems like quite the way to do it. To be fair, I think if I given the choice, I would quite like to do something like that as well. I'm not one for the massive cities, so I think I probably would have settled for a nice, quaint. I suppose it's quaint. I've never been to Zaragoza. I'm making a massive assumption there, but it feels like a nice place. I've only ever heard nice things about Zaragoza, Paul. Have you?
Only positive things, yeah. And on the postcards that I've seen as well, it does sell quite well.
Yes, and I suppose again from our perspective, probably at the time where you were either living in Zaragoza, Liam, or you were planning to go and live in Zaragoza, this was kind of the first time that I'd heard of something outside of Real Madrid and Barcelona when it comes to Spanish football, especially sort of in the early 2000s. We're not going to start the story there because there is a little bit of a prelude to that segment. I suppose it's the 1990s, Liam, that we can really focus on, where Real Zaragoza, they don't come from nowhere. They're an established side, aren't they? They're a side of note. They're a famous side for their history. But during the 1990s, they took a bit of a punt on a very young manager, Victor Fernandez. Appointed it. Was he 30 years old at the time, something like that? Very strange.
Very much so, yeah. Very much a punt, as you say. Historically, Real Zaragoza in 1932 had some glorious years back in the 60s. But yeah, had a steady La Liga side for most of their existence. And then obviously along came Victor Fernandez. I think Miguel Pereira mentioned this before, that they were a side. Victor Fernandez's approach to football was quite innovative in a way. His style of football, was before a lot of the other teams came along, started playing in a very similar kind of way. He was quite a pioneer in that sense, and it didn't work straight away. I mean, I think it's important to remember that there was when I first got there, he was in charge, and one of the first games I went to was against Borussia Dortmund, actually, and that was incredible in the UEFA Cup. Andres Brema playing for Real Zaragoza against his compatriots, that year I was there, they weren't necessarily that great. I saw some awful games that year. Gustavo Poyet was also in that side. Obviously, went on to manage Brighton and had a good playing career, didn't he, with Chelsea as well. But he didn't make it happen straight away. But there was a key moment, and I was actually this game as well. The Copa del Rey final against Celta de Vigo was quite interesting. You talk about Uro Celta and how great they were to watch. The Celta of Chechu Rojo in 1993-94 was absolutely dreadful. Actually, he went on to be a manager of Zaragoza later on, and his Zaragoza side were no more entertaining to watch. But that was a dreadful game. I was there. It was in Madrid, and they went on penalties, and that was what kick-started what came afterwards. Of course, that qualified them for the European Cup Winners' Cup, and I think most British football fans of a certain age will remember what happened in May 1995, weren't they? I don't know if Paul was perhaps just about old enough for that. I know Nick, you were probably just about still in nursery, I imagine, but Paul remember it. He was in primary school by then.
Yeah, I was only 5 at the time, so.
All right, so you were similar then.
We remember it well.
Your parents let you stay up late to watch it.
And I suppose from a Victor Fernandez point of view, like you say, you look at some of the other, clubs in Spain, and we've talked about a few of them at time, that they always seemingly tend to put their trust into old, tried and tested, seasoned managers, didn't they? You're looking at your likes of Lourdes Aragonés, etc., Vincent Del Bosque, and for them to do this for a 30-year-old just seemed quite innovative. And as you said, he kind of changed how Real Zaragoza played football, but introduced a new style of play, which was very, very high risk and very, very attacking. Am I fair to say it was, inspired for what we see nowadays? Like I say, that's the football that we see all the time, isn't it? It's not too much focus on that defending, is it, nowadays, Paul? It's all about taking risks. It's all about attacking as much as you can. This seems, let's say, 30 years ahead of its time. It was quite strange to see, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it was for the era, absolutely. And it's, you watch back now. I mean, I was saying to you beforehand, for myself, as we often do whenever we pick a club that we're going to talk about on these podcasts, that you fall down a bit of the rabbit hole of watching back, clips and things. And there was an excitement about it. I mean, I'm just thinking back to the game that we're going to get onto in a minute, the night in Paris. Some of the attacking play on show there was, you'd like that from your team now, and so for it to be 30 years or so ago, it was ahead of its time. It's not as, when you think back to mid-90s football and what we know of it, it's not quite Route 1. We'd moved on from that, but it was longer grass and less ball on the floor than perhaps we get nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's and nowhere else better to do it than La Romareda as well for me. But let's talk about that night in Paris, because I'm sure this is a day that is just etched in history for Real Zaragoza, isn't it? So just to set the scene, they go up against Arsenal in Paris. Arsenal managed under Arsene Wenger. I think he'd been in there for a couple of seasons, but obviously he was starting to assemble the squad that would go on to eventually be the Invincibles and really implement his football there. You know, we look at the side that, you know, had the likes of, you know, Tony Adams inside it, John Hartson, Ian Wright, David Seaman in goal. We'll talk about more in a second. But, you know, this was Real Zaragoza going toe-to-toe with a European giant, you know, dare I say for the first time, Liam, would you say that's right?
Yeah, very much so. I think this was a real, not quite David and Goliath. I mean, they had obviously Juan Snyder up front, who already had a bit of reputation for himself by that stage. But yeah, absolutely massive underdogs in this game, weren't they? Even though this wasn't quite the finished article as far as the Invincibles were concerned, they were still, as you say, being assembled. They were real hot favourites to win this game, weren't they, Arsenal? And they didn't.
No, it finished 1-1 at the in the Parc des Princes, and it all comes down to extra time. We're in the 119th minute at this point, and hopefully I don't butcher this, but Naeem, who is born in Ceuta as well, I noticed as well when I was researching this, which I find quite fun. Anyone who's born in an enclave, I just immediately gravitate towards. But I suppose the most interesting part of his stories is a former Spurs player, which just rubs salt in the wounds, doesn't it, Paul? It's just like, here you go. I'm going to lob Seaman from 40 yards, win this trophy for Real Zaragoza, and I used to play at White Hart Lane.
Yeah, it's got everything in it there, and it all the boxes ticked, and it's a great hit. But I don't want to skirt over the fact that Snyder's goal was also a very good goal as well. The turn and hits it from outside the box with his left foot as well. Seaman beaten twice from long range in that game, and both excellent goals, top quality goals, really.
Yeah,
I think was it John Hartson as well that scored for Arsenal to draw level? I think it was, wasn't it? Both Zaragoza goals were brilliant.
Which goes back to how long ago this was when we talk about John Hartson in a Arsenal shirt. Even most people our age, Paul, would maybe remember him more likely from his time at Celtic, for example.
Celtic,
this is long before that, and it's obviously fantastic to see Real Zaragoza win this European trophy. European silverware is always appreciated, and this team really does become the stuff of legend among Real Zaragoza fans. I bet you speak to people at Real Zaragoza now, fans and people like that probably still talk about this day now, even though it was 30 years ago. Well, that's horrible to say. 30 years ago.
Yeah, very much so. And I think that's half the problem, isn't it? Perhaps what we're getting onto later on in the show is that people do hark back to that moment and sort of think, how on earth did we get to this? And what, you can't, I don't think any Real Zaragoza fan felt when this happened that it was going to be a sort of regular occurrence. I think it was something that they appreciated, something really special, which might never be repeated. But it's a long way down from being a European trophy winner to being in Segunda for over 10 years, isn't it, really? And I think that's the problem. People who are old enough to remember those days and a lot of the success that came after that particular European success. Clearly, they never did it again, but they had a certain amount of domestic success after that. Still can't quite work out why we're in the mess we're in right now. Yeah,
it would be fair to say, especially from the time that maybe we got more in tune with La Liga football, Paul, is that Real Zaragoza to me were always the cup team. They were the formidable Copa del Rey side, and obviously they went on to beat Celta Vigo in 2001. Again, beat Real Madrid 3-2 after extra time in Montjuic as well, which is a famous final. That's one I definitely want to talk about one day, Paul, because that's just absolutely crazy. And in that 2004 squad, I noticed the other day someone shared a picture of David Villa playing for Real Zaragoza. Yeah. Completely forgot that happened. I think they brought him in from Sporting Gijon, didn't they? But you've got to remember at this time that Real Zaragoza were making moves for really top quality footballers and recruiting really well, weren't they, Liam? Like, I won't recall to say I've seen David Villa too much in a Real Zaragoza shirt. He looked fucking brilliant in that Lotto kit, it must be said. But, in this era, you were like, these are wonderful footballers. These are brilliant stars, aren't they?
Yeah, there's certainly, we were never really competing, as say, for the league. I think once or twice we threatened to make it into the Champions League, but generally not really ever a realistic ambition. But yeah, very much a sort of not just from cup success, but a team that were constantly pushing to get into the UEFA Cup based on league position, and not being able to sign the very best players, but signing players who went on to become real stars and eventually, in some cases, had to be sold on. They did do some very good recruitment as well. They picked up some players. The scouting network was good, but they were also. And I think that maybe is an example. He went off to have a stellar career, didn't he? But I'm not sure that Real Zaragoza would have got anywhere near him if some of the big boys had noticed how good he was up at Sporting de Gijón. I think they stole a march on some of the big teams, and that became a little bit of the way with Zaragoza. They signed some good players, but they were only ever going to stay there for a certain amount of time before the big boys came calling, and David Villa was an example of that, of course.
Yeah, they become a stepping stone, don't they, Paul? And there's so many players that I suppose it's a bit in two halves, because you've got that early noughties Real Zaragoza where they were signing, unearthing gems, so to speak, and I think they particularly did really well with that when it comes to recruiting from South America. We're going to talk about the Militao brothers very, very shortly and such, but it kind of feels like a bit of a tale of two halves, because they did the early naughty stuff, had success, especially in the Copa del Rey. Winning silverware is winning silver at the end of the day. You look at like what happened with Crystal Palace this year, beating, I'm sorry, Paul, Manchester City in the FA Cup final. It still means stuff to clubs, and we've already spoken about the Copa del Rey in this era. It meant something to them to go and do that, and the fact they managed to do it twice and get to a final against Espanyol, all within a 10-year decade, is absolutely fantastic. But the second half of the noughties, where they may be, is it fair for me to start describing it as Moneyball kind of recruitment? Some of the
signings. Change in tact, isn't it? Yeah, it's a change in approach. And you're right as well. We definitely intended to cover the Zaragoza Copa del Rey triumph. We said after we did the last Copa del Rey one that the Zaragoza, well, we're basically going to cover that entire 10 years of Copa del Rey finals, aren't we, at some point? So we won't be forgetting about that. It's a subject to come back to. It means something to clubs, and it's an era where, like you said, we think of them as more of a cup team when you think back to the early 2000s, and from the early 2000s success of unearthing gems, it was the phrase that we used to switch in their approach with the recruitment, and it comes at a cost, doesn't it? There's a there's a twist in the tail, so to speak, with that. But we should appreciate the fantastic players as well that pass through the doors. I mean, obviously you mentioned David Villa, but there's Danny and Savio and Galetti as well, who come through the club doors they're in the 2004 squad, aren't they? Obviously it changes to the likes of Pablo Aimar and that as we get a bit later on into that decade as well. Fantastic players, but is it the right approach? It's definitely a change, isn't it? And what impact does that have on the club and the connotations to follow?
How does it look looking back now, Liam? At maybe this 10-year picture. Let's go from say 2000 or maybe let's even go back even further, like 1998 to 2008 with that second relegation. It must still be a fun time, but it must be quite difficult as well to see how quickly the house of cards caved in on itself.
I'm afraid the situation is not that dissimilar to the one that you experienced a little bit later in Malaga. Your team, you've got an owner coming in, Agapito Iglesias, who buys the majority shareholding in the club in 2006. And the story is very, very similar for the next few years, to be honest. As you mentioned, Paul, the likes of Pablo Aimar, some really glitzy players, but ultimately, I don't think the recruitment, it was all about, trying to, listen, Altani obviously spent his money very well in terms of what he brought in and took Malaga much higher than Agapito Iglesias ever managed to do with Real Zaragoza. But I think the intention was the same. It was all about, marquee signings and all about impressing people with his tenure initially. But clearly, as with Malaga, it became clear that the huge debts were being racked up to try and create this fantasy team. And as you say, this is towards the end of the 2000s. In the early part of 2000s, under different stewardship, their approach had been quite different. And they did sign some great players, but I think most of those went on to become great players. As you say, they used Real Zaragoza as a stepping stone. If you look at, you mentioned the Milito brothers, ultimately, Gabi Milito went on to play for Barcelona. He had several years at Zaragoza, did really, really well there. Diego Milito, slightly different. He actually left when Real Zaragoza got relegated that first time to Segunda, went back to Genoa. He'd been there before and believe that he decided to go back there because he really liked it there, not because there were probably some better offers on the table. Of course, Diego Milito most famous for those 4 goals in the semi-final, and unfortunately they then lost to Espanyol in the final, as you documented a few weeks ago. But 4 goals against Real Madrid in the semi-final, 6-1 victory. The stuff of dreams, I mean, these are the kind of results that I don't think Real Zaragoza fans will ever see again. So there were some glorious moments in that sort of 94 to 2006 period, but after then it became far more checkered. I'm afraid that is down in no small part to the new majority shareholder who later became the club president, Agapito Iglesias.
Yeah, I think if I remember rightly, Diego went on to play for Inter Milan after Genoa as well. So again, we talk about the lineage of things. You'd think him going back to Genoa would sort of like be maybe going backwards ever so slightly, maybe in terms of the platform, but then obviously then going to play in Europe. I think he was part of Jose Mourinho's side that won the Champions League, if I remember rightly.
Yeah, he was.
Which again is just mental to think. And those two brothers, the fact that they both came across to Real Zaragoza and saw that as a club, as a destination to go to, is really, really fun, because they've got quite a strange story behind them, don't they? Back in Argentina, one playing for Real Racing, and the other one playing for not Real Racing Club, sorry, and the other one playing for Estudiantes, who I'm sure everyone who listens to this podcast really know. There's 2 teams in Buenos Aires that have got a stadium like a stone's throw from each other, aren't they? If you're looking at a picture, they've got one big blue stadium, one big red stadium. But the fact that they then decide to say, you know what, we've been at opposite clubs our entire careers, let's go to Spain and have some fun. You've got to be glad they picked Zaragoza, Liam, as their destination, because they were bloody brilliant to watch, weren't they?
Yeah, I mean, interesting. I think actually Diego initially went to Genoa. They didn't start off. Gabi predates Diego at Real Zaragoza by a couple of years, I think. So but it was great. I mean, maybe Gabi just sort of said to Diego, "Come and join me over here. It's quite fun." And it's. I think I always liken Zaragoza in that era to sort of West Ham. Do you know what I mean? If you made an ex-West Ham United 11 from the sort of 90s and the 2000s, you'd have an amazing team with the likes of, Frank Lampard, Joe Cole, the whole string of really, really fine players that moved on, and even going a little bit earlier, there was other players who sort of launched their careers at West Ham and then went on to bigger and greater things with other clubs. And I feel Real Zaragoza was very much like that, but we did very well out of those players in that era. And probably after that, it was a little bit more of a kind of a try and sign the stars. I mean, listen, I love Pablo Aimar, but I think it's fair to say he never really lived up to his billing at Real Zaragoza. And it was, as you said, a very different approach, not a Moneyball approach at all, unfortunately. It was all about throwing the money at it and throwing money he didn't have as well. And it didn't work particularly well. And then at the end of it all, when somebody had a look at the coffers, they were decidedly empty.
Yeah, because Paul, my core memories of Real Zaragoza in this time, rightly or wrongly, will be Pablo Aimar, Roberto Ayala, but both who had seen Rafa Benitez, Valencia, and throughout the north. When they turned up there, that was kind of like, that's what put Zaragoza, truly on a map for me, and thinking, oh, these guys must be mint because they've got Pablo Aimar playing from, signing them on FIFA and stuff like that. I suppose, obviously, the story that we know now and this fall that they had, this is a big part of it. But I suppose back then, in terms of widening the appeal of Real Zaragoza, making the awareness of Real Zaragoza as a club of note, those signings did help, didn't they?
Yeah, and we've seen that sort of thing before in other leagues and in other decades, and in Spain in other eras as well, with players being brought in to sort of galvanize support or attract new support as well. But it doesn't necessarily work out because of the financial burden that it can sometimes place. I think it was an interesting point when we were talking about the Galacticos project. I know it's not the same scale or anything like that, but we also did touch on the subject as well slightly with the Benitez episode, having the right blend of of names, and having an organic squad as well of people who get the club, who are not necessarily money motivated, but and that ability to gel the two together, and from a financial point of view, offset the weight of one with the lightweight structure of wages that you have in other parts of the squad. With Zaragoza, as we saw, it becomes a yo-yo or a turbulent period, and obviously there's a legacy of financial issues that follow. But for me, like, you know, obviously I'm slightly younger, but it did make me think. You know, it drew my attention to the club, seeing, as you say, players that we'd heard of the names of and seen win the league at Valencia, in Aymar and Ayala in particular, joining them. But it can come at a cost, and it has a lasting impact, doesn't it? You know, it's not quite a Blackburn Rovers story with Jack Walker's money, and then, but it's you know, it's a tale that will repeat itself throughout football, won't it?
It is. I will not shy away from the fact that I had a few Real Zaragoza saves on Football Manager.
Yeah.
And as always, Steve Finnan, right back, you're in. First sign ever made. Every single time, irregardless. But it was one of those fun sides where you could, you know, really... it was recognisable, is I suppose the point I'm trying to make. And I think when you are, you know, you're not too down into the weeds of what's happening off the pitch, and or even fully aware of what's going on it as well. You just literally look for the bills and titles and say, "Oh, Pablo Aymar, oh, Roberto Ayala," and etc., etc. Then that's what really brings to it. And again, with the lotto kit with the points coming into the middle, it's burnt in there. You know, if for every single football kid that I can remember from the 90s and noughties, I could be a doctor if I just chucked that out of my head right now and replaced it with medical knowledge, because that would be absolutely... it's just crammed with stuff like that. But as we know, this wasn't the better times, because obviously they were relegated in 2008 with this squad. How did it feel in Zaragoza at the time, Liam? You know, was it confusion, or was it looking down the long barrel? Did you see it coming, or was it rug under feet?
No, I think it was, you know, in that year that they got relegated, they had four different coaches. I think more so the next time, I think they bounced back straight away, which of course was great. And as I say, I understand, you know, Iglesias's principle behind this, as you say, trying to make them more household names, but they were pretty much household names already. It was just a kind of a real lack of understanding of what was required at that time. And yeah, they struggled through another couple of years, and then they had this infamous game at the end of the 2011-2012 season, which I was actually at in Valencia, between Levante and Real Zaragoza, and they needed a win to stay up. And there's been a lot of talk since about that game being fixed, shall we say. And Levante didn't need anything out of the game, and Real Zaragoza certainly did. But even then, there was a feeling of, you know, at the time in the stadium, of course, I was not aware of any of that, although Levante were fairly underwhelming, has to be said. But I think you would have hoped after that they would learn from that really near escape. It was literally the last game of the season, and, you know, try and push on from it, but also a sense of doom, impending doom. And of course, the following year, the end of the 2012-2013 season, they actually finished last and were relegated from La Liga and have never been back since. So it's 12 years now since they've played in the top flight.
Am I right in thinking, sorry to cut in there, Nick, Liam, is this the period now? So after the 2013 relegation, this is where it's something ridiculous. Is it 7 managers in 5 years, or 7 managers in?
Yeah, it's just crazy. I mean, there's no, obviously, Victor Fernandez had quite a long period in charge back in the 90s, and yeah, incredible instability, and that very rarely works, does it? And unfortunately, that pattern has kind of followed, kept on, you know, recurring really over the last 12 years as well. There hasn't been a lot of stability as they try in vain to get back to the top table, and yeah, it's just a mess. And I think people are beginning to realise that, you know, all is not well behind the scenes in terms of the club's financial position. And eventually, they do manage to, Agapito Iglesias, who has become a real, you know, figure of hate by this stage, is essentially persuaded he's run out of town pretty much, and leaves. But of course, leaves with massive debts behind him, and doesn't appear to have managed to take those with him. That club 11, pick up the pieces. And we're talking about, a foundation that take over that don't really have, the sort of money that they need to try and clear these debts. They were so astronomical that you needed somebody to come in with serious money to just try and, try and clear the table and start again. And that didn't happen, of course. And so that's been the case really for the last. Well, there's been a new ownership more recently, but yeah, that legacy of that really poorly run club for, I would say, 4 or 5 years of really, really poor stewardship from Senor Iglesias, and years of consequences because of that.
Yeah, and I think especially when falling down into Spanish Segunda, obviously great for you and your show. You get to talk about your club every single week, which is is quite a nice element. But I think any measure of a fallen giant for me, and we did touch on this in the Deport episode, Paul, didn't we? Is when you've been above your rival for such a long period of time, to have that dominance and then for that dominance to be challenged. Aragon's not an area that's filled with football clubs. And I might be naive in saying that, but obviously your biggest rivals is Huesca. And obviously they had their day in the sun in La Liga during this period. And obviously they've been in the same league as you for a long period of time now. But there was the best part of maybe 2 decades where you basically didn't see each other. And now it's been every year practically for the last 13, hasn't it?
Well, no, actually, that's the really depressing part of it, Nick, is that historically our rivals have never been Huesca, because Huesca spent most of their lives in semi-professional football, not being in the same division as Real Zaragoza. Our traditional rivals, even though not in Aragon, were Osasuna. And so, in a sense, that's the really depressing part of it. In fact, many Real Zaragoza fans still refuse to acknowledge Huesca as a true rival because they feel like it's not acceptable to have them as a rival. It's again an indication of how bad things have got, that this pesky little team down the road, actually, who as you said, since those 12 years in Segunda, they've spent several seasons Huesca in La Liga, and they've also invariably finished above us in Segunda when they've been in Segunda. So yeah, they're now sort of almost lording it over us, despite for most of their history not even being considered a rival. They were just like a pinprick in the distance, really, and now they are probably the closest you get to a rival, but as I say, not universally acknowledged as one. But I mean, look how far Osasuna are ahead of us right now. Embarrassing to think that they were once on an even keel really with us.
See, that's what happens when you try to learn football rivalries from a book, ladies and gentlemen. You need to go to the horse's mouth and find out all this information.
Hey, well, I will win over the Zaragoza fans that you may have upset there, Nick, by saying that actually I wouldn't really know much about Huesca if it wasn't for George Orwell getting shot near them and writing about it in homage to Catalonia, because he was up on the hills looking over Huesca, wasn't he, at the time? And then obviously the club came along a bit later into my radar of thought. And yeah, it's I can see Osasuna being a bit more of a blood boil for Zaragoza fans than Huesca.
Just in terms of size, really. I mean, obviously, it's not all about the size of these Spanish cities, but if you look at the population of Huesca compared to the population of Zaragoza, I mean, you mentioned earlier on a quaint little town to a certain extent. I think, unfortunately, Nick, it's not really a quaint little town. It's quite a lot bigger than that. It's actually twice as big as Bilbao, for instance. And so if you're then being asked to compare it to Huesca, 60,000, 70,000 population, I think, it's literally Zaragoza's 10 times the size. So, I think that's the problem. And looking at fallen giants and looking at some of the things that I've discussed, at length with Alex Fitzpatrick on the Spanish Segunda show, that is part of the problem right now for this particular fallen giant, is that they need to get over the past. They need to forget about this. Huesca are now their rivals, never mind Osasuna. They're fading away into the distance, and there needs to be a bit of a reality check now. They are, regardless of their storied history, they are more a Segunda club right now than they are a Liga club. And they just need to knuckle down and get on with it and stop sort of turning their nose up at the pesky neighbours.
Well, almost after this season as well, Liam, almost not a Segunda club. Obviously, it was quite touch and go for a little time here. And would it be fair for me to say that, similar to Malaga, it was more the curry of the 4 teams being worse, or like say doing Real Zaragoza the favour? Because towards the back end of the season, it felt like a plummet for Real Zaragoza. And how obviously we've seen the likes of Depor and Malaga drop into El Pozo, obviously the other podcast we do, but the Well, which is Premier Ref and below. But for Real Zaragoza to fall in there as well, would it be of a similar ilk, or do you think it would actually maybe have been a bit worse for Real Zaragoza because they wouldn't have the means or the appeal to bounce back straight away?
I don't know. I mean, I think that it was, not potentially not quite as terminal for them as it would have been, for instance. I mean, Malaga survived it, didn't they? So it wasn't terminal for them. Depor survived it for a few seasons. The owners, the ownership nowadays is an American group of investors. I'm not suggesting that they would have been completely happy with being relegated, but I don't think the club would have gone bust, is what I'm saying. Whereas, there was clearly a danger of that, wasn't there? At Malaga, I don't know how long they could have survived down in Premier F before things started to get very tricky. But I think the difference there is that, I don't know, listen, I'm not an expert on Depor fans, but I sense that they are a more unified bunch. I think Malaga probably only one season. How would it have been if they'd stayed down there a couple more seasons? Maybe they wouldn't have been so unified. But I get the sense that those clubs are fairly united. I don't really see that. I mean, listen, there is a passionate fan base at Real Zaragoza, don't get me wrong, but I think there are some people who just need to, give their hands a bit of a wobble, really, and realise what situation we're in. And it's not just last season, Nick, that we just about survived. The season before was exactly the same. Survived, I think, with 2 games to go, winning at Racing Santander on the penultimate weekend of the season. So there have been some times when they've been close to getting back up into La Liga twice. 3 times made the playoffs and once been within 6 minutes of returning in 2014-15, but ultimately they haven't, and now it's time to look at where we are at now and to reevaluate. But we get a situation about this time of year every year where everyone goes, thank goodness for that. We're still in Segunda, right? Let's reset over the summer. Let's try and sort our squad out. Let's get a new coach in. And as you know, Gabby has just recently been given a contract to take things forward. And as Paul alluded to earlier on, I think the problem is that in recent years, as soon as things have started to go wrong, they've got rid of the coach. And you just can't have that. You can't have that constant. And I know that there have been some doubts raised about Pellicer, but I think you do need a little bit of continuity, don't you, really? You can't keep on chopping and changing all the time.
Yeah, that consistency is key, isn't it, Paul? And I suppose, do you think that's something that Real Zaragoza need to do going into next season, or even seasons beyond, to have any hope of going into La Liga? Because the new owners that they've got, I think it's Jorge Mas, isn't it, and co. They're also financially backing Inter Miami, so obviously they've got deep enough pockets to give Lionel Messi a weekly wage. So imagine that they can maybe possibly share a little bit over with Real Zaragoza. We've obviously got the new stadium being built as well. So I don't know if they're going to call it the Nueva or Nuevo Romareda, Liam. I don't know if that's been announced yet, but obviously changing this iconic venue. A bit similar to the way I look at Malaga, to be fair, is that all these positives, Paul, probably contribute towards a positive future. Can we say that about Real Zaragoza?
You've got to hope so, haven't you? Really? Otherwise, what's it all for? Look, there are people who have mixed feelings about, or tend to generalize any US-led investment into football clubs. And I think a lot of the criticism that US investors get is quite unfair. For this to work, it needs a bit of patience, and it does need the word stability. And whether that be keeping a coach that you support, or keeping a framework for the club, be it off the pitch, on the pitch. You've got to do that to give it a go. You can't keep chopping and changing, as Liam said. The last decade or so has shown it doesn't help things. So up into a temporary stadium for the next couple of seasons, and then into the new one is a long-term. It has to be a long-term commitment, doesn't it? To be part of it, and to do that, you need to make sure that the operations continue with the same level of stability. So I can't speak for whether the current coach is the person, the right person for the job, but the ownership needs to decide on who is the right person for the job and back him. And it's not just the head coach as well. You need to think about, well, what's the infrastructure around, particularly when you've had 12 years or so outside of the top flight where it's been quite turbulent, and you've had a lot of financial issues hanging over you as well. And not everything has to be done, with money. Some of it can just be done with patience, and football and a lot of patience. It's a result business. It always is, and money is the driver for those results. But we've seen it with other clubs that have been resurrected, that just investing in an idea sometimes and not making a change of coach every time you lose a couple of games is one way of steadying the ship. I'd like to think that there is a plan there now for you. Liam, you're better placed to comment than me on this.
I think it's really interesting because I think there's two things to bear in mind here. First of all, you said about the American ownership groups. Well, yeah, I think American ownership groups don't like throwing money at it either. I think if you look at Liverpool, for instance, as a classic example of an ownership group that want to make the project financially viable. And we talked about this. I talked about this with somebody from Liverpool actually when that same ownership group was talking about buying Malaga and saying one of the attractions of Segunda clubs and even La Liga clubs, if you can afford them, is that this límite salarial. So they can't throw money at it. They're not allowed to. They can't, and that's actually, a blessing for them in a way. And I'm not saying that. I think it's probably something where ownerships are expected to come in, and I think people still don't quite get that, and you can't just throw money at it in Segunda, and they're not throwing money at it. And the other issue that you brought up there is the one of chopping and changing coaches. But where do the chopping and changing coaches come from? Usually, it comes from the fans getting impatient, the fans chanting for the manager to go. And then, of course, the who is always going to be the sacrificial lamb in that situation. You're not going to sack all the players. You sack the coach, don't you? And that's why I say that a big part of this rests really with the fans. I'm not suggesting, and it's so hard, isn't it? Because, as football fans ourselves, I can't stand sort of, meek compliance. I don't have a problem with people saying this isn't good enough, this is rubbish, But there is a balancing act to be had, isn't there? In the sense that, earlier on this season, and I don't have a huge amount of time for Miguel Ángel Ramírez as a coach, didn't particularly like what he did Sporting de Gijón. Wasn't particularly excited when he was named as the Real Zaragoza coach earlier this season. But the first home game, they're losing to Tenerife, who are in the relegation zone. The fans are chanting, Ramírez leave, Ramírez go. And it's his first home game in charge. And it's like, come on. That's just ridiculous, and the pressure that also puts on the players, in the sense that, and a very good player, Elias Chaira, who's currently at, he might be La Liga next year with either Mirandés, probably not with Mirandés, but, he's a great player, put it that way. Actually, he's at Real Oviedo. Sorry, he was at Mirandés. And then when he was thinking about where to go next, he went to Real Oviedo, and he quite openly said part of that is because I had enough from Real Zaragoza, but I didn't think that would be the right place, the right environment for me to thrive as a young player. Basically, I thought the fans were going to boo me every time I gave the ball away. So there are lots of factors to this, aren't they? And I know a lot of really great Real Zaragoza fans, and I totally understand the frustration, but it isn't going to help right now, And so yes, you can look at the ownership group. The sporting director obviously is key, and I think that the sporting directors in recent years have signed some right duffers. To be honest, they've not done the job particularly well, but the bottom line is that everyone needs to get together. And the hope, I suppose, although we love La Romareda, I've had many happy memories in there, maybe moving away from it for a couple of years, perhaps having a little bit of a reset and having a little bit of, starting again to a certain extent, even though the temporary stadium is significantly smaller and is never going to quite match up to what La Romareda was in its heyday. Maybe that will help the whole situation. But everybody needs to pull together, I think, here, and that may be, and it will still take time because there are other teams that are stolen a march on us. And right now it's about contending again for top 6, which we haven't done for several years now. So let's hope that happens. And as always, we're optimistic this time of year about our teams, aren't we? I'm sure Nick is sitting there thinking, yeah, I reckon Malaga can build on last season's mid-table finish and push for those playoffs. It's what keeps us going, isn't it? And so there will be many very optimistic people around Real Zaragoza right now. And when things don't quite, live up to expectations by October, we need to just take a reality check and calm down, and hopefully that will things will right themselves to a certain extent, rather than throwing twice out of the pram and getting another new coach in.
Just on that point, then, Liam, does Zaragoza suffer from a divided fan base in terms of you've got conflicting fan groups that tend to, rather than having a unified voice, or is it all when one fan says they've had enough of the coach, they all tend to jump on it, or is it more of a divided one?
I think there's just a real sense of impatience. Impatience. I mean, I went to watch, and I don't like to keep coming to Malaga, but I think Malaga are quite a good example. I think Malaga's history. I mean,
you talk about Malaga, I'm fine with that.
I think Malaga went quite a lot higher, and more recently than Real Zaragoza have done. Obviously, they had these glorious games in the Champions League and everything. But I think the parallels are similar in terms of the clubs that had somebody come in and promise the earth and then couldn't deliver it, because it wasn't a sustainable project. I think those two things are very similar. Happened at a very similar time as well. And I went to watch Malaga against Real Zaragoza early on this season. I keep saying the season's finished, but yeah, last season, should we say. And Malaga were crap, to be honest. They were really poor. And I didn't really hear much mumbling and grumbling from the home fans at all. And it wasn't a very good performance, and they were on a pretty poor run, and they weren't playing. I don't think they played great football all season, if I'm perfectly honest. But I just sat there thinking, if this were the other way around, and if Malaga were winning against Real Zaragoza in La Romareda, and Zaragoza were playing like Malaga were playing, there would be uproar. There's just that sense of patience and entitlement and frustration. And that's what I'm saying. You need to forget about the glory years now. I would like to think that we are, it's very much, a sleeping giant. And we could someday be great again. I don't think we'll ever get back to a European final, but we could be great again. But we're not there at the moment. And so we need to just look at the context of where we are now. And I think Malaga fans, I suppose, still have the ability to unite against the owner. Our horrible owner's gone. We've got another unpopular owner instead now, or a group of owners. So maybe Malaga have that sort of focus for their discontent. And Zaragoza can only, fans can only sort of focus on the players being rubbish and the coach not knowing what he's doing. I don't know, but I just feel like there are other teams out there, and Depor the same, who've fallen on hard times, who have had very glorious, fairly recent histories, and deal with the disappointment of being Segunda better than Real Zaragoza do.
Yeah, because I think the big thing from Malaga perspective is the feeling that they're on a ship that's rudderless at the moment. They can't go anywhere. So, like you said, they've got to put all their energies into, keeping the team where they are. Supposedly, the objective there was maybe from a Real Zaragoza perspective is that Jorge Mas came in and not that he made promises, but he offered a new dawn, which seems to have not actually kicked off yet, or seems to have gone backwards since he came in as well, which is is a shame. But there's still obviously scope to go and do better. And as maybe to finish on a positive about the especially the La Romareda and the Real Zaragoza fan base, as much as they are quick to get on top of crowd, they're also fantastic at sucking the ball into the net. And just to end on, what magnificent nets they are! Oh, they are the best in Spain, aren't they? These goalposts, they are just magnificent, and I really do hope they keep them. Paul, thoughts on the goalposts at La Romareda?
Yeah, I love them. They're a nice throwback to yesteryear. I think the depth on them is phenomenal. They are going to be. The new stadium's going to be configured to accommodate them, surely, Liam. That's got to be.
Oh yeah, it must be. I think that would be such a drastic mistake if they didn't do that. I think they're so iconic, as you say. Then they're known the world around, aren't they? And of course, they were used in the 1982 World Cup, and they were there then. And Zaragoza will host some of the games in the 2030 World Cup. So it would be inconceivable that those beautiful deep goal nets were not. We're not recreated in the new stadium. And you're right. I mean, I feel like when I listen back to this, I'll think I've complained a lot about Real Zaragoza fans, but they are fantastic as well. And I was there early in the season when Gaetan Poussin headed 90, he's the goalkeeper, and headed a 93rd minute equaliser against Eibar, and the place absolutely erupted. I mean, on a good night, or a good afternoon, what we're going to call it, it was a phenomenal place. watch football, and the fans are so passionate about their team, as many others are, of course. So yeah, it can be a wonderful arena in which to watch football, and I really hope that they're going to do a good job with the new stadium. I think Matt Harrison said in the past, hasn't he, your former co-host at the Gillycast, that he feels that when they redo Spanish stadia, you said it as well, Paul, haven't you? I think that when they redo Spanish stadia, they tend to do quite a good job of it, and so I'm really hopeful that that they do make a good job of this one, and that we'd love to be in La Liga by then, but if not, that we kick off on a high when it's back in action in a couple of years.
I think what's that? Did they say about the Tower of London when the Ravens leave that the kingdom will fall? I think if when the goalposts leave,
just can't do this. Like cutting off Samson's hair.
Yeah. No, they are very good in Spain at redeveloping stadiums. I think it was San Mamés in particular that we called out that it was an iconic stadium that. How do you try and improve on it? And somehow they've managed to make a as modern stadiums go, they've made a beautiful one. So here's hoping that they have they decided on a name for the new one yet, or
I haven't heard it. I mean, I suspect they might try and call it the I don't know.
Yeah, or maybe a sponsorship one.
It's even the Banqueria Thor now, isn't it? Unfortunately, so
What are they calling the one in Miami? Is it Freedom Park? What's Spanish for Freedom Park, Liam? It could be like a stadium.
No, that's not going to work. No, I don't know. Yeah, I imagine one would hope it would be La Nueva Romareda, but to say if somebody comes on with a big chunk of cash, I imagine they'll allow it to be sponsored. But yeah, I think it's I think all fans are excited about that. We did love the old stadium, but it was looking very tired by the end, and it did need it. And obviously the World Cup coming up, and the opportunity to get a new stadium built for you, pretty much with significant funding from the local council, and again, ultimately that's a result, isn't it, for the American owners? They haven't even had to build this new stadium themselves. I think the jury's very much out on them. But again, I think that, as you say, that the hands are tied in terms of the finances to a certain extent. It's up to the sporting director to bring in the players that make it work, and a coach that's able to work with those players. And the last couple of sporting directors have really not made that happen at all. So we'll have to hope that the squad that they assemble this summer is more successful.
We will. And if they don't put those goalposts back in La Romareda or in the Nuevo Romareda or whatever they're going to call it, do you remember that lad who cable tied himself to the post at Goodison Park? I will do that at Romareda until they put them back in, because it'd be a travesty if they don't. But I think very much like in the way we finished it with the Depor episode as well, Paul. It feels like they're not in a good spot for Real Zaragoza compared to Depor. Depor obviously very much seeming to be on their way up. I think there just needs to be a spark for Real Zaragoza, doesn't there? They need to maybe just have a season where it all just clicks. Like you say, they keep the manager consistency, the recruitment maybe hits right, the players gel, and all of a sudden, very much like Real Oviedo or Mirandés, you find yourself in a playoff final for going up to La Liga, and all of a sudden you're back. And I think that's the thing for Real Zaragoza, is that they would, be back, and they would be, a giant returning to the big table, wouldn't they?
Yeah, and you could say that maybe the new stadium would offer a chance at a fresh start, but it's 5 years away, and I don't really think that, based on what Liam said there, that Zaragoza fans have got the patience to wait another 5 years to have a refresh. But key to getting to that point is to is to have some stability and to build something and do it with the right infrastructure around it. And here's hoping for you, Liam.
I think it'll be 2 years. I think it'll be done in 2 years. Obviously, the World Cup's 5 years away, but I think the idea is to get it done a lot sooner than that. Yeah, I think the plan is only to have 2 years at the temporary stadium. I think the interesting thing as well is you're right about Depor, Nick, but next year will be interesting for them. Because I think most Depor fans this season will be just delighted that they're back in Segunda after several years in Pozo. And obviously there's a big buzz around there right now because Yanamai, against all the odds, has decided to stay. And he's. That was really not expected by anybody. But now they need to deliver. They brought in, obviously, Hidalgo from Huesca, who's had a great season, really against the odds with a very, very low budget team. he is going to have a bit more money to spend, obviously, at Depor, and he needs to deliver. And I don't think they would necessarily expect to be automatically promoted, but I think they'll be expected to be in the playoffs. And that's a lot to ask of them, isn't it? And so, although much as I think that Real Zaragoza fans, become extremely impatient and it's not very productive, if Depor were still in Segunda in 10 years' time, they might well be saying the same thing, mightn't they? So it is one of those where you just think, the impatience has grown annually. Maybe it's time to set the old to one side now, but I think it's natural, and I think that most clubs with the history that Real Zaragoza have had would be thinking, it's about time that we ended this by now.
I'll take my Malaga hat off for a second and maybe put a suggestion on the table. Deportivo de La Coruña versus Real Zaragoza playoff final at Riazor, because as much as I appreciate the graph that goes into building a temporary stadium in I assume the car park or adjacent to, not too far from.
It's way over the side of town, actually, stand by the river. I mean, I think that's another bit of result, because from what I understand, they've managed to get the council to pay for that as well, I think. So we're quids in on this particular stadium, new stadium, and also the temporary stadium. But it's way over the other side of town, but quite a central location. So I think it will draw the fans, but I'm not sure they'll get in, because it only holds 20,000. I think they've got more season ticket holders than that, so it'll be hard to get into. But you're right, it wouldn't be quite the same. And I think a full Riazor would be the right place. But of course, they're two legs, so you're going to have to come to Real Zaragoza for the second leg if that's a playoff final. Obviously, that would depend on Real Zaragoza finishing higher in the league. But we're a lot away from it. I think most Zaragoza fans would take challenging for the playoffs, because we've had a couple of good seasons for the first 5 or 6 games, and then after that it's been absolutely abject. So I think if we could still be in contention for top 6, in sort of March or April, most fans would absolutely.
Maybe the new stadium, Liam, should be called the El Meccano, if it's going to be made like by metal. I just hope it stays stuck down and you don't get too angry with it, which I know is a terrible joke, but if you fancy using it for your Spanish Segunda show, that's free from me. That's all right.
Thank you so much, Nick. I might pass on that.
I imagine El Mercado probably something really horrible in Spanish as well, isn't it?
That was worth waiting for.
It used to be a band called Mercado. I didn't like them very much either.
Well, we shall end it there anyway. This has been a great episode, and thank you so much, Liam, for coming to talk to us about Real Zaragoza. As we spoke about before, it's not a club I know massively about, or a place, as I've revealed this evening. But I want to thank you very much for your time, and I genuinely do hope Real Zaragoza do better than they did last season and can get back up to that top 10 as well, because they're a fantastic club that should be in La Liga in my book. And I'll say thank you to you as well, Paul. It was a pleasure to be back recording with you after our hiatus last week.
Yeah, likewise, Nick. Likewise. Good to see you again. I did miss you, like I said at the start. And Liam, thank you. I could listen to you for hours. So thankfully, you do have several podcasts, which is now your opportunity to plug. But it is always good to listen to you. You're a man of incredible knowledge and great stories as well. So feel free to tell people where they can listen to you if they're not already aware.
Yeah, I do this podcast about Primera Ref with this guy called Nick Bell. Actually, I quite enjoy that. Yeah, it's quite a good one. And brilliant. I've been doing one for several years with Alex Fitzpatrick about. I just cover lower league Spanish football, basically, 2nd division, 3rd division, you name it.
It's your insurance policy, isn't it? In case Zaragoza go down, you can still talk about them.
The brilliant thing about it as well is that Alex started the show with me, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago now, and he's never actually had to talk about Mallorca, as you will know well as a Mallorca fan yourself. Whereas me, I get to talk about my crap Real Zaragoza every single week, which is not a blessing in disguise, I can assure you. But it's brilliant. It's great that so many people listen to us, and I'm really enjoying the new venture with Nick as well. So please do come and listen to us if you have any interest at all in 2nd or 3rd division Spanish football.
Absolutely excellent. And obviously, finally, I'll say thank you to everybody at home. If you want to keep up to date with more nostalgia-based Spanish football, then do head over to our social medias. We've got an X or Twitter. We've got an Instagram. We've got a TikTok as well. Don't know how to use it, but it's there. So do go follow those. We put nice pictures up of Luis Figo or of old football stadiums that aren't there anymore. The time beforehand, which we love so much. But yes, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll catch you again next time. Hasta luego.